Clara Hayes existed in a fog of grief. The world muted since her younger brother, Ethan, was stolen by a sudden accident. Days blurred into weeks, marked only by hollow visits to St. Michael's Cemetery, a place that felt both closer to him and strangely unsettling. Haunted by guilt and a desperate yearning, she stumbled upon local folklore, whispers of the cemetery gates opening at midnight. A threshold to the spirit world, a dangerous, impossible legend. Yet for Clara, adrift in sorrow, it held a terrifying flicker of hope, a chance, perhaps, to bridge the chasm death had carved. Let's begin the story. Get comfortable and listen closely. The silence in the small apartment was a physical weight, pressing down on Clara Hayes, suffocating her. It had been 6 weeks since the phone call. 6 weeks since the world tilted on its axis and threw her into a landscape painted in shades of gray. Ethan was gone, her bright, infuriating, irrepressible younger brother, silenced forever by a senseless collision of metal and momentum on a rain-slicked road. Clara traced the rim of her cold coffee mug, the chipped porcelain familiar beneath her fingertip. Every object in the apartment seemed to scream his absence. The scuffed patch on the wall where he'd accidentally kicked his football indoors. The worn controller for the game console they'd spent countless hours battling over. The faint scent of his ridiculously strong cologne still lingering in the hallway closet. Grief wasn't a single emotion, it was a monstrous, shape-shifting entity. One moment, it was a leaden numbness that made even breathing feel like a chore. The next, it was a searing agony that ripped through her chest, stealing her breath and leaving her gasping. And always, simmering beneath it all, was the guilt. She shouldn't have let him go out that night. She should have insisted he wait until the storm passed. She should have. The should-haves were a relentless chorus, replaying the final moments, twisting memories into instruments of torture. They had argued, something trivial about borrowing her charger without asking. Her last words to him hadn't been, "I love you," or, "Be safe." They had been sharp, impatient. Now, that triviality felt like a catastrophic failure. An unforgivable sin. Clara pushed the coffee mug away, the lukewarm liquid sloshing near the brim. She stood up, her movements stiff, automatic. She needed air. She didn't know what she needed. Connection? Absolution? Proof that Ethan wasn't just gone? Her feet carried her, as they often did these past weeks, towards the edge of town, towards St. Michael's Cemetery. It rested on a gentle slope overlooking the town, a sprawling expanse of weathered headstones, manicured lawns, and ancient, brooding trees. In daylight, it possessed a certain melancholic beauty, a quiet dignity. Clara found a strange solace in walking its winding paths, stopping at the simple granite marker bearing Ethan's name, Ethan Hayes. Beloved son and brother, 2004 to 2024. She'd sit on the cool grass beside it, sometimes talking to him, whispering apologies and memories into the indifferent air. Other times, she'd just sit in silence. The quiet hum of the nearby town, a distant counterpoint to the louder silence of the grave. It was the closest she could get to him now. This patch of earth beneath a perpetually gray sky. But lately, even St. Michael's had begun to feel different. As the sun dipped lower, casting long, distorted shadows across the stones, an unease would creep into the edges of her awareness. The rustling leaves sounded less like nature and more like whispers. The familiar shapes of crypts and monuments seemed to shift subtly in her peripheral vision. It felt watchful. She'd find herself glancing over her shoulder, the hair on the back of her neck prickling, though she never saw anyone. Today, the feeling was stronger. A chill wind, unusual for late spring, snaked through the wrought iron fence, carrying the scent of damp earth and something else, something indefinable and ancient. The caretaker, Mr. Finch, was locking the main gates for the evening, his movements slow and deliberate. He nodded curtly as she passed him on her way out, his eyes, deep set in a network of wrinkles, seeming to hold a flicker of pity. Or perhaps something else. Warning? Back in the suffocating silence of her apartment, Clara felt the familiar wave of despair wash over her. The visits weren't enough. Talking to a cold stone wasn't Ethan. The need for something more, something tangible, clawed at her insides. She missed his laugh, his terrible jokes, Even his infuriating habit of leaving wet towels on the floor. The finality of his absence was a wall she couldn't scale. A truth she couldn't accept. The grief was a raw, open wound, and she was desperate for anything. Anything at all that might offer a moment's relief. A sign. A connection across the impenetrable veil of death. Little did she know. The cemetery she visited for solace held secrets far deeper and darker than the sorrow buried beneath its soil. Sleep offered no escape. Clara's nights were plagued by fragmented dreams, Ethan laughing, then fading, the screech of tires, the accusing silence of the cemetery. She'd wake with a gasp, heart pounding, the grief fresh and raw as if the news had just arrived. The long, empty hours of the night stretched before her, amplifying her solitude. One such night, adrift in the blue glow of her laptop screen, Clara fell down a rabbit hole of local history forums and obscure paranormal websites. Anything to distract from the gnawing ache in her chest. She clicked idly through grainy photos of town landmarks, articles about long-forgotten mayors. And then, she found it, a cluster of posts discussing St. Michael's Cemetery. It wasn't the standard ghost stories, the predictable tales of white ladies or spectral soldiers. This was something different, more specific, more insidious. The legend spoke of the cemetery gates, the heavy, ornate wrought iron gates she passed through every visit. According to the scattered, often contradictory accounts, precisely at the stroke of midnight, under certain conditions, a new moon, the anniversary of a tragedy, or sometimes, simply when the veil between worlds thinned, the gates of St. Michael's would unlock and swing open on their own. This wasn't merely a malfunction or a prank. The legend claimed the opening marked a brief, terrifying window where the cemetery transformed. It became a liminal space, a porous boundary where the spirit world bled into the living. The dead, it was whispered, could walk freely within its confines during that hour, revisiting the places they knew, drawn by the pull of memory and unfinished business. More disturbingly, the legends hinted that the living, if they dared to enter during this time, might be able to communicate with the departed. Some posts spoke of fleeting whispers, others of shadowy figures, and a few, darker still, warned of getting lost, trapped not just physically, but psychically, caught in the cemetery's spectral embrace until dawn broke the spell, or worse. Most commenters dismissed it as fanciful nonsense, creepypasta, or embellished folklore passed down through generations to scare teenagers. Just kids trying to spook each other. One comment read, "Old man Finch probably forgets to lock them properly sometimes," scoffed another. But Clara couldn't dismiss it. In the depths of her grief, logic held little sway. The desperate, irrational part of her, the part that would bargain with any devil for just one more moment with Ethan, seized upon the legend. A glimmer of impossible hope ignited in the darkness. What if it wasn't just a story? What if there was a chance, however slim, however terrifying, to connect with him? To tell him she was sorry? To hear his voice one last time? The thought was both intoxicating and chilling. Morbid curiosity warred with a primal fear. The unease she'd felt in the cemetery lately took on a new, sinister dimension. Were those feelings just her grief playing tricks? Or had she sensed something real? The next afternoon, driven by a compulsion she couldn't fully explain, she found herself back at St. Michael's. The sun was bright, birds chirped in the ancient oaks, and the cemetery seemed almost benign. Mr. Finch was trimming the hedge near the entrance, his movements methodical, his face impassive. Clara hesitated, then approached him, clutching the strap of her bag. "Mr. Finch?" He paused, lowering his shears, and looked at her over the top of his wire-rimmed spectacles. "Miss Hayes, paying your respects again?" His voice was gravelly, tinged with the local accent. "Yes," she mumbled. "Actually, I wanted to ask you something. It might sound silly." He waited patiently, his expression unreadable. "I was reading online about the cemetery. About legends. Specifically, about the gates at midnight." She felt foolish saying it aloud. Finch's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his deep-set eyes. He took a slow breath, smelling faintly of earth and oil. "Ah, the midnight gates," he sniffed, resuming his trimming with deliberate snips. "Old wives' tales, Miss Hayes. Stories to keep youngsters from causing mischief after dark. Nothing more." But people online seemed convinced. They mentioned things happening. He stopped again, turning to face her more fully. His gaze was steady, almost unnervingly calm. People convince themselves of all sorts of things, especially when they're searching. He seemed to choose his words carefully. This place, he gestured vaguely with his shears towards the rows of headstones, holds a lot of history, a lot of sadness. It's easy for imaginations to run wild, especially at night. Best leave the cemetery to the dead after sundown. Miss Hayes, it's their time for peace. His dismissal felt practiced, rote, yet there was an edge to his voice, a subtle undercurrent that hinted at something more than simple disbelief. Was he just trying to protect the cemetery's reputation? Or was he hiding something? Protecting her? His words should have reassured her, relegated the legend back to the realm of internet fantasy. Instead, they did the opposite. The careful way he spoke, the slight hesitation, the veiled warning disguised as common sense, it solidified her resolve. The seed of desperate hope, planted by anonymous whispers online, had taken root. Mr. Finch's denial, meant to deter, only fanned the flames of her morbid curiosity and grief-stricken yearning. She would have to see for herself. She had to know if the gates truly opened, and what lay beyond them in the deepest hour of the night. The decision, once made, settled in Clara's stomach like a cold stone. It felt both insane and inevitable. For the next few days, she went about her routine in a daze, the midnight legend a constant hum beneath the surface of her thoughts. She researched tide charts for the new moon, not that the legends agreed on conditions, but it felt like a necessary, almost ritualistic step. She checked the weather forecast obsessively. Clear skies predicted for Friday night, telling herself it was just to debunk the ridiculous story, to prove Mr. Finch right and put the unsettling idea to rest. She planned her vigil. She would go, wait near the gates, see nothing happen, and come home, perhaps finally able to accept that Ethan was truly beyond reach. But a deeper, more honest part of her acknowledged the desperate hope fueling this madness, the hope that the legend was true. Friday evening crawled by with agonizing slowness. Clara forced down some toast, her appetite non-existent. She dressed in dark clothing, pulling a beanie low over her forehead, feeling like a character in a cheap spy novel. At 11:30, heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, she slipped out of her apartment building and into the cool night air. The walk to St. Michael's was nerve-wracking. Streetlights cast long, distorted shadows, turning familiar streets into alien landscapes. Every rustle in the bushes, every distant car engine, seemed amplified, ominous. She clutched her phone in her pocket, its weight a small, inadequate comfort. As she approached the cemetery slope, the air grew colder, carrying the familiar scent of damp earth and cut grass. But tonight it seemed heavier, more cloying. The wrought iron gates loomed ahead, silhouetted against the faint glow of the town lights behind her. They were massive, imposing structures, intricately worked with scrolls and stylized crosses, anchored to thick stone pillars. And they were firmly closed, secured by a heavy chain and padlock, just as Mr. Finch had left them earlier that day. Clara found a spot across the narrow lane, partially concealed by the overgrown branches of a wild lilac bush. From here, she had a clear view of the gates and the entrance path leading into the darkness beyond. She checked her phone. 11:48 p.m. Silence. Not the peaceful quiet of the countryside, but a deep, oppressive silence that seemed to absorb sound. The usual nocturnal chorus of insects was strangely absent. Even the wind seemed hesitant, breathing only in faint, intermittent sighs through the yew trees lining the cemetery wall. The moon, a barely there sliver, offered little illumination, leaving the cemetery cloaked in profound shadow, punctuated only by the stark white gleam of the occasional marble angel or obelisk deeper within. Minutes ticked by. 11:55 p.m. Clara's breathing was shallow, her senses hyper-alert. She scanned the darkness within the gates, searching for any sign of movement, any flicker of unnatural light. Nothing, only the unwavering stillness of the dead. Fear warred with anticipation. Part of her desperately wanted something to happen, validation for this insane quest. Another part prayed for nothing, for the comforting normalcy of locked gates and silent stones. The unease she'd felt on previous visits returned, magnified tenfold. It felt as if the darkness itself was watching her, Holding its breath, the air grew perceptibly colder, raising goosebumps on her arms beneath her jacket. 11:58 p.m. Her muscles were tense, her eyes straining in the gloom. She could hear the frantic thumping of her own heart. Was that a flicker of movement near the old mausoleum to the left? No, just a trick of the light. A branch swaying. 11:59 p.m. The oppressive silence deepened, stretching taut like a drawn bowstring. She held her breath, eyes fixed on the padlock, glinting faintly in the ambient light. This was it, the moment of truth or foolishness. Midnight. Somewhere in the distant town, a clock tower chimed, the sound faint and mournful on the night air. Clara waited, every nerve ending tingling. One chime, 2, 3, all 12. And then, nothing. The gates remained stubbornly shut. The padlock held firm. The silence pressed in, unbroken. The cemetery lay still, dark, and resolutely ordinary. A wave of disappointment, sharp and unexpectedly bitter, washed over Clara, quickly followed by a flush of embarrassment. She felt profoundly foolish, sitting hidden in the bushes, waiting for a ghost story to come true. Mr. Finch was right. It was just an old wives' tale. Grief had made her irrational, desperate, willing to cling to the flimsiest of hopes. She slumped back against the rough bark of the bush, the adrenaline draining away, leaving her feeling empty and exhausted. Time to go home. Time to face the hard reality that there were no magic gates. No midnight reunions, just the crushing weight of loss and the long road of grief ahead. She pushed herself wearily to her feet, ready to turn away from the silent, mocking gates of St. Michael's Cemetery. Clara took a step back towards the lane, the crunch of gravel under her boots sounding unnaturally loud in the profound stillness. A sigh escaped her lips, heavy with resignation and the bitter taste of dashed hope. Foolish, utterly, desperately foolish. She pictured Mr. Finch's knowing, pitying eyes. He knew the stories, knew the desperation of the bereaved. He'd probably seen others like her, drawn to the cemetery's edge by grief and folklore, only to retreat disappointed. She turned her back on the gates, ready to walk away, to leave the unsettling quiet and the weight of her own gullibility behind. She'd taken perhaps 2 steps when the sound reached her. Click. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp, metallic, and utterly distinct in the oppressive silence. It sliced through the night air like a shard of ice. Clara froze, every muscle locking. Had she imagined it? A branch snapping? An animal? No, this was different. This was mechanical, precise. Slowly, hesitantly, she turned back towards the cemetery, her eyes fixed on the gates, straining in the dim light. Everything looked the same. The heavy padlock still hung from the chain, seemingly undisturbed. Had she just been imagining things? Her nerves were frayed, her mind playing tricks. Then she saw it, a subtle shift. The thick, rusted chain, which had been looped tightly through the gate handles and secured by the padlock, seemed looser. It wasn't taut anymore. And the padlock itself, was it hanging at a slightly different angle? Before she could process this, before doubt could fully reassert itself, another sound followed, a low, protracted groan of ancient, protesting metal. Kriak. Her breath caught in her throat. Disbelief warred with rising terror. The right-hand gate, the massive slab of wrought iron that must have weighed hundreds of pounds, was moving, not rattling in the wind, not being forced. It was swinging slowly, deliberately inward, opening into the blackness of the cemetery. The movement was impossibly smooth for such old, heavy gates. It was as if unseen hands were pushing it, guiding it open with silent, inexorable force. The padlock and chain hung slack now, rendered utterly irrelevant, bypassed by some unseen mechanism or force. As the first gate swung inward, revealing a deeper slice of the cemetery's Stygian interior, its counterpart on the left began to move as well, mirroring the slow, ghostly opening. The creaking intensified, a discordant symphony of stressed hinges echoing in the night, a sound that scraped along Clara's nerves. A wind, colder than before, suddenly swept out from the opening gateway. It wasn't a natural breeze, it felt purposeful, carrying with it the scent of deep earth, decaying leaves, and something else, something cloying and faintly sweet, like overripe flowers on a grave. It ruffled Clara's hair and chilled her to the bone. Despite her jacket, the atmosphere within the cemetery seemed to change instantly. The oppressive silence she'd felt before now felt charged, humming with a latent energy. The darkness within the gates seemed deeper, less like the absence of light and more like a tangible presence. Thick and velvety, the air grew heavy, pressing down on her chest, making it harder to breathe. Clara stood rooted to the spot, halfway between the concealing bush and the now opening gates. Fear, cold and paralyzing, gripped her. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to get away from this place, to flee back to the mundane safety of streetlights and locked doors. This wasn't folklore, this was real. Impossibly, terrifyingly real. The legends were true, but interwoven with the fear was another, more insidious force, the raw, aching grief that had driven her here in the first place. Ethan, the desperate hope, which had seemed extinguished only moments ago, flared again, stronger and more dangerous than before. If the gates opened, if the veil thinned, could he be in there? Was this her chance? The gates reached their fully open position, resting silently against the inner stone pillars, offering an unobstructed invitation into the heart of the midnight cemetery. The cold wind continued to flow outwards, a spectral exhalation. The darkness within beckoned, promising secrets and reunion, while simultaneously radiating a palpable sense of ancient power and dread. Clara's feet felt leaden, disconnected from her conscious will. The logical part of her brain screamed warnings, flashing images from horror films, tales of foolish mortals straying where they shouldn't. But the grieving part, the part that missed Ethan with an intensity that eclipsed reason, urged her forward. She took a step, then another, drawn by a compulsion she couldn't name or resist, pulled towards the yawning darkness like a moth to a flame. Clara Hayes walked towards the impossible threshold, towards the open gates of St. Michael's Cemetery at midnight, leaving the world she knew behind her. The heavy iron seemed to watch her approach, silent sentinels guarding a realm that should never be entered by the living after the 12th chime. Crossing the threshold felt like stepping through a membrane, an invisible barrier separating the mundane world from something else. The air instantly grew colder, seeping into Clara's clothes, chilling her skin. The heavy scent she'd noticed earlier intensified: damp earth, decaying vegetation, that faint, cloying sweetness mingling with a mineral tang, like ozone before a storm. She paused just inside the gateway, her eyes struggling to adjust. The familiar layout of St. Michael's was still recognizable, the main path stretching ahead, flanked by rows of graves, but everything felt subtly, profoundly altered. It was as if she were looking at a photograph negative of the place she knew. The sliver of moon, which had offered meager light outside, seemed completely absent here. The only illumination came from a strange, diffuse luminescence that didn't appear to have a source. It clung to the edges of the headstones and monuments, making them stand out against a darkness that felt absolute, absorbing light rather than reflecting it. Shadows pooled unnaturally deep, clinging to the bases of statues and the hollows between graves, seeming less like absences of light and more like patches of tangible blackness. They writhed slightly at the edges of her vision, suggesting movement where there should be none. The silence, too, had changed. Outside, it had been oppressive but empty. Inside, it felt full, pregnant. Beneath the surface quiet, there was a low, almost sub-audible hum. A vibration felt more in the bones than heard with the ears. And carried on the cold, swirling air were whispers, faint, sibilant sounds, like dry leaves skittering across stone, or voices heard from a vast distance. They were indistinct, impossible to decipher, yet they seemed to brush against her ears, intimate and chilling. Clara took a tentative step forward onto the main gravel path. The sound of her own footstep was jarringly loud, echoing strangely in the charged atmosphere. She glanced back instinctively. The gate stood wide open behind her, framing the view of the lane outside. The distant streetlights of the town seemed unnervingly far away, small and insignificant, like stars viewed from the bottom of a deep well. A sudden, irrational fear seized her. What if the gates closed behind her? She pushed the thought away, focusing on her reason for being here. Ethan. She started walking slowly down the main path, her gaze darting nervously from side to side. The gravestones, familiar from her daytime visits, seemed different now, larger, more imposing. The carved names and dates felt like watching eyes. Marble angels appeared less serene, their sculpted faces contorted into expressions of sorrow or silent warning in the strange light. Stone lambs seemed poised to leap from their pedestals. Obelisks pierced the unnatural gloom like accusing fingers pointed towards a non-existent sky. A sense of disorientation washed over her. Although she knew this path well, it felt subtly wrong. Longer, perhaps? Or were the turns slightly different? She passed the weathered stone marking the grave of a Victorian-era mayor. A landmark she usually noted, but it seemed oddly placed. Further down the path than she remembered. Was her fear distorting her perception? Or was the cemetery itself shifting? The whispers grew slightly louder, swirling around her like eddies in an invisible current. They seemed to emanate not from a single source, but from the air itself, from the ground beneath her feet, from the ancient stones saturated with centuries of grief and memory. She strained to make out words, but they remained elusive, a chorus of fragmented sighs and murmurs just beyond the edge of comprehension. Loneliness, regret, cold, lost. The impressions brushed against her mind, unsettling and sad. She pulled her thin jacket tighter around herself, shivering despite the lack of any real wind now. The cold wasn't just physical, it was emotional. A penetrating chill that seemed to target the soul. The weight of the place pressed down on her, the combined weight of all the lives buried here. All the sorrows interred with them. It was a palpable presence, ancient and melancholy. Her goal was Ethan's grave, located in a newer section deeper within the cemetery grounds. She tried to focus on that destination, pushing through the rising tide of fear and disorientation. But the further she walked, the more alien the environment became. The air grew heavier still, thick with unspoken things. The shadows deepened, seeming to coalesce in the spaces between the graves. And the whispers were beginning to sound less like random noise and more like voices waiting to be heard. Waiting for her. Clara forced herself onward, deeper into the labyrinthine heart of St. Michael's. The main path branched, and she took the fork she knew led towards the newer section. Towards Ethan, or at least, the fork she thought led there. The disorienting feeling intensified. Familiar markers seemed absent or misplaced in the strange, sourceless light. It was as she passed a large, weeping willow tree, its branches drooping like skeletal fingers towards the earth, that she first saw it. Not saw, precisely, more like, registered. A flicker of movement in her peripheral vision, over by a cluster of crumbling 18th-century headstones. She turned her head quickly, eyes scanning the deep shadows beneath the willow. Nothing, just the gnarled trunk, the drooping leaves, and the leaning stones, etched with names long faded by time and weather. She dismissed it as a trick of the light, a product of her frayed nerves. But the feeling of being watched, which had started as a subtle unease outside the gates, was now a concrete certainty. It prickled across her skin, a cold awareness that she was not alone among the dead. She continued walking, her steps more hesitant now, her gaze constantly flicking towards the periphery. Then she saw another. This time, it was clearer, though no less unsettling, standing partially obscured behind a tall, granite obelisk further down the path. It wasn't solid, not exactly. It was a shape, vaguely human-formed, but composed of deeper shadow. Like a tear in the fabric of the night. It was utterly still, seemingly observing her. As she stared, trying to make sense of its form, it seemed to thin, dissolving back into the ambient darkness as if it had never been there. A gasp escaped Clara's lips, misting in the unnaturally cold air. Her heart hammered against her ribs. These weren't ghosts in the traditional sense, no white sheets. No rattling chains, no distinct features. They were more like impressions, manifestations of the cemetery's oppressive atmosphere. Or perhaps something else entirely. She quickened her pace, wanting desperately to reach Ethan's grave, clinging to the hope that his presence might offer some kind of anchor in this increasingly terrifying place. But the further she went, the more frequent the sightings became. A fleeting shape darting between two mausoleums. A dark form standing motionless beside a tilted cross, only visible when she wasn't looking directly at it. A cluster of indistinct figures gathered near a weathered family plot, their outlines blurring into the gloom. They never moved quickly. They never made a sound beyond the pervasive whispers that seemed to follow her. They simply appeared, watched, existed. Their presence was passive, yet deeply unnerving. They didn't seem overtly hostile, showed no sign of aggression. But their silent, collective observation felt like a judgment, a silent questioning of her intrusion into their domain. Clara felt a chilling sense of being surrounded. Outnumbered. How many were there? Dozens? More? They flickered at the edges of her sight, sometimes appearing more solid, sometimes dissolving into mere suggestions of form. They were like embodiments of the cemetery's grief, coalesced memories given fleeting shape in the midnight hour. She risked a glance behind her. Several dark forms stood scattered along the path she had just walked. Silent sentinels watching her retreat. There was no escape in that direction either. She was well and truly inside now, immersed in the cemetery's spectral reality. The whispers seemed to intensify in proximity to the figures, swirling around them like unseen currents. Were the figures the source of the whispers? Or were they merely drawn to the same psychic energy? Clara couldn't tell. All she knew was that the air crackled with their presence, heavy with unspoken sorrow and the chill of the grave. Panic began to claw at the edges of her control. This was too much. The hope of contacting Ethan felt increasingly naive, overshadowed by the sheer, alien wrongness of this place and its silent inhabitants. She wasn't finding connection, she was finding something ancient, vast, and utterly indifferent to her human grief, except perhaps as something to be observed, or maybe even consumed. She needed to get out. Now. Forget Ethan's grave, forget the foolish quest. She just needed to escape the oppressive darkness and the unnerving gaze of the midnight figures. She turned, abandoning her search for Ethan's plot, and started heading back towards the entrance. Towards the gates she prayed were still open, but the path ahead looked different again, unfamiliar, twisting away into deeper shadow, and the figures seemed to be subtly closing in. Panic lent speed to Clara's feet, but the cemetery seemed determined to thwart her. The path she thought led back to the entrance twisted unexpectedly, ending abruptly at a high, ivy-covered wall she didn't recognize. She backtracked, heart pounding, trying another fork, only to find herself deeper in a section of older, crumbling graves, the air thick with the smell of decay. The layout was actively resisting her, shifting like a living labyrinth designed to confuse and ensnare. The midnight figures were more numerous now, less fleeting. They lined the edges of the paths, stood motionless amongst the headstones, their shadowy forms becoming marginally more defined in the eerie luminescence. Their silence remained absolute, but their collective presence felt like a physical weight pressing in on her. Desperation clawed at her throat. She fumbled in her pocket for her phone, her fingers numb with cold and fear. The screen flared to life, momentarily blinding her. One bar of signal, barely there, flickering precariously. It was a miracle it worked at all in this place. Her thumb trembled as she scrolled through her contacts. Past her mother, past friends she hadn't spoken to since the funeral, landing on the only name that offered even a sliver of potential help: Finch. A caretaker. She'd gotten his number weeks ago, ostensibly to ask about plot maintenance regulations, but filed it away. Now, it felt like her only lifeline. She pressed call, holding her breath, lifting the phone towards the non-existent sky as if that might help the fragile signal. It rang once, twice, 3 times. Each ring echoed the frantic beat of her own heart. Just as she was about to lose hope, ready for it to go to voicemail or disconnect, the ringing stopped. A click, then silence. For a heart-stopping moment, she thought the call had dropped. Then, a voice, gravelly and instantly recognizable, crackled through the speaker. "Hello?" Mr. Finch sounded sleepy, slightly irritated. "Mr. Finch? It's Clara. Clara Hayes." Her voice was a shaky whisper, barely audible. There was a pause on the other end. Then, the irritation in his voice was replaced by something else. A deep weariness, resignation. "Miss Hayes." He didn't sound surprised. "Not at all. I had a feeling I might be hearing from you tonight. Mr. Finch, you have to help me." The gates, they opened. Just like the legend said. I came inside. I know it was stupid, but I had to, and now I can't get out. The paths are changing, and there are things here. Tears welled in her eyes, hot despite the chilling cold. The gates, I tried to go back, but they're closed. They locked themselves. Another pause, longer this time. Clara could hear the faint sound of him breathing on the other end. A steady, slow rhythm. When he spoke again, his voice was low and grave. stripped of any pretense. He sighed. The sound staticky over the poor connection. They do that. Once you're inside after the stroke of midnight. The gates belong to the cemetery. Not to us. They won't open again until dawn. If you're fortunate. Fortunate? What do you mean? If I'm fortunate. Panic seized her again. What is this place? What are these figures? The legends aren't just stories. Miss Hayes, Finch said, his voice heavy with the weight of knowledge he clearly wished he didn't possess. Not entirely. St. Michael's, it's old. Older than the town, some say. There's power here, deep in the earth. At midnight, especially near the turn of the moon or when strong emotions linger, the boundaries blur. It becomes a liminal space. A bridge, of sorts. A bridge? To where? To the echoes. Miss Hayes. To the memories. To what lingers. He avoided calling it the spirit world directly. The figures you see, they aren't ghosts in the way people imagine. They're manifestations. Echoes of grief. Fragments of memory given form by the cemetery's own consciousness. Drawn out by the midnight hour. Mostly, they just watch. But the cemetery itself, that's what you need to be wary of. The cemetery? It's alive? The idea sent a fresh wave of terror through her. Not alive like you or me. It's aware. It remembers everything buried within its soil. It feels the grief. And it doesn't always take kindly to intrusion. Especially from the living, carrying their fresh pain into its domain. It can trap you, confuse you, feed on strong emotions. Feed? The word hung in the air, chilling Clara to the core. It draws things in, holds them. The legends warn, some who enter at midnight don't leave when the sun comes up. They become part of the quiet. His words were stark, terrifying. How do I get out? Clara pleaded, her voice cracking. Please, Mr. Finch, you have to know. There's no simple way. Lass, he said, his voice softening slightly with something akin to pity. You can't force your way out. The cemetery won't allow it until its time is over. At dawn, fighting it directly will only make it hold tighter. You need to endure, and you need to be careful. Careful of what? Of bargains, he said cryptically. Of whispers that promise what your heart desires most. This place, it can offer illusions, twist your grief against you. Don't trust easy answers or familiar faces you might think you see. Remember why you came, Miss Hayes, but don't let that reason become your prison. What do I do? She whispered, feeling utterly lost. Keep moving, if you can. Don't stay in one place too long. Don't draw too much attention. Respect the space, even in your fear. And, hold on to yourself. Hold on to what's real. Outside these gates, dawn is still hours away. Survive until then. The line crackled ominously. Signals fading. Miss Hayes, be careful. And, try not to listen too closely to the whispers. The line went dead, plunging Clara back into the suffocating silence. Broken only by the sibilant murmurs carried on the cold air and the frantic beating of her own heart. She was trapped in a place that was aware, potentially hostile, populated by shadowy figures born of grief. Until the uncertain hope of dawn. And Mr. Finch's cryptic warning about bargains and illusions echoed ominously in her mind. Survive. But survival in this shifting, spectral labyrinth felt terrifyingly uncertain. Mr. Finch's warning echoed in Clara's ears. Keep moving. Don't stay in one place too long. Taking a shaky breath, she forced her numb legs to obey, choosing a path that seemed slightly less menacing than the others. Hoping it might eventually loop back towards the entrance. Even if the gates were locked until dawn. Staying near the theoretical exit felt marginally safer than venturing deeper. But the cemetery had other ideas. The concept of direction seemed fluid, unreliable within these midnight bounds. The path twisted and turned in ways that defied logic and her memory of the layout. Gravestones she recognized seemed to appear on the wrong side of the path. Or vanish entirely. Replaced by unfamiliar monuments. A small, stone angel she used as a mental marker near the eastern wall suddenly loomed directly ahead. Suggesting she'd somehow circled back or been inexplicably transported. Panic tightened its icy grip. This wasn't just disorientation, it felt deliberate. The cemetery wasn't merely a passive container for the supernatural. It was actively manipulating its own geography. Playing with her, hurting her. Preventing any straightforward navigation. It was a maze, constantly reconfiguring itself. And she was the rat trapped within. The midnight figures became bolder. Their presence more oppressive. They no longer kept strictly to the periphery. Occasionally, a shadowy form would drift across the path ahead of her, forcing her to stop or detour. They didn't touch her, didn't make any sound, but their silent proximity was unnerving. Their featureless shapes seemed to absorb the strange light, making the path ahead even darker. Sometimes, as she passed close to one, she felt an intense wave of cold, far colder than the ambient air, accompanied by a fleeting, overwhelming sensation, despair, regret, confusion, before it faded as she moved away. Were these the emotions Finch had warned her about, bleeding off the figures, or perhaps emanating from the cemetery itself? She tried to focus, to ignore the figures and the shifting landscape, recalling Finch's advice to hold on to what was real. She thought of her small apartment, the chipped coffee mug, the bustling noise of the town outside these walls. She pictured Ethan's smile, not the haunting image from her nightmares, but his genuine, gap-toothed grin when he found something funny. These anchors felt flimsy, distant, threatened by the overwhelming reality of the spectral cemetery. The whispers intensified, no longer just background noise. They seemed to coil around her, brushing against her ears, sometimes sounding like they were coming from directly beside her, even when no figure was visible. The fragments were clearer now, though still disjointed. Never forgave, so cold, didn't mean to, find the way home, forgotten. Snippets of countless lives, countless deaths, countless sorrows, swirling in the air like psychic dust. Clara clapped her hands over her ears, trying to block them out, but it was useless. The whispers weren't entirely auditory, they resonated inside her head, pressing against her thoughts. The sheer weight of accumulated grief in this place was staggering, threatening to drown her own sorrow in its vast, cold ocean. She stumbled over an unseen tree root, catching herself on a leaning headstone. The stone felt unnaturally cold, almost burning, and for a moment, she felt a jolt, a vivid flash of sensation, not her own, of falling, of pain, of a final, rattling breath. She snatched her hand back, gasping, rubbing her palm as if trying to wipe away the residual death chill. The cemetery wasn't just aware, it remembered tactilely, viscerally. Lost, cold, and increasingly terrified, Clara sank onto a low stone bench nestled between two overgrown cypress trees. She needed a moment, just a moment to collect herself. But Finch's warning echoed, "Don't stay in one place too long." As she sat there, shivering, the shadows around the bench seemed to deepen, coalescing. The whispers grew louder, focusing, as if her stillness had made her a target. Several midnight figures drifted closer, their vague forms solidifying slightly in the gloom. Silent observers drawn to her fear and despair. The cemetery was watching her, testing her, waiting. She had to move. She pushed herself back to her feet, her legs shaky, and plunged onward into the shifting, illogical maze. The silent figures her only companions in the terrifying labyrinth of St. Michael's at midnight. Escape seemed less likely with every step she took deeper into the unknown. The further Clara wandered, the more the whispers changed. They were no longer just ambient, fragmented murmurs swirling in the air. They began to feel directed, focused. They emanated not just from the air, but from the stones themselves, from the very earth beneath her feet, and most unnervingly, directly from the midnight figures that drifted ever closer. As she passed a weathered granite slab, a clear, reedy voice, thin as paper, seemed to whisper directly into her left ear. "He never brought the roses." The sound was so distinct, so close, that Clara flinched violently. Stumbling sideways, she spun around, but there was nothing there except the stone and the oppressive darkness. Yet the sense of lingering disappointment, of a promise unkept for decades, clung to the air. Further on, near a small, moss-covered stone marking a child's grave, a soft, sobbing sound seemed to rise from the ground. It wasn't physical sound, but an impression of inconsolable sorrow that pierced Clara's heart, layering onto her own grief. Mama, lost? The midnight figures, too, seemed to find their voices, though not in the conventional sense. As one drifted near, a tall, stooped shadow by an angel monument, Clara didn't hear words, but felt them pressed into her mind. Years of regret, the argument unspoken, silence is heavy, so heavy. The weight of an entire lifetime's worth of unspoken apologies and festering resentment washed over her, almost buckling her knees. These weren't coherent conversations, but raw, unfiltered emotional bleed-through, fragments of memory, moments of intense feeling, echoes of final thoughts, regrets, pleas, warnings, all rising from the countless dead resting uneasily in this charged space. It was overwhelming, a psychic cacophony threatening to shatter her sanity. The collective grief of the cemetery wasn't just a passive atmosphere anymore, it was actively imposing itself on her. She felt flashes of emotion that weren't her own, the sharp pang of betrayal, the dull ache of loneliness, the sudden terror of a violent end, the quiet resignation of long illness. Each wave buffeted her, eroding her own sense of self, making it harder to hold on to her own identity, her own specific sorrow for Ethan. Finch's warning about the cemetery feeding on emotion took on a terrifying new meaning. Was it consuming these echoes? Or was it amplifying them, projecting them onto her, the sole living intruder? Was her own potent grief acting like a beacon, drawing these fragments towards her? She tried to block it out, humming tunelessly, focusing on the gravel crunching under her boots, reciting Ethan's favorite stupid limericks in her head, anything to create a barrier against the onslaught. But the whispers seeped through, insidious and pervasive. They resonated with her own guilt, her own regrets about Ethan. Should have said sorry, a whisper hissed as she passed a tilting cross. Too late now, always too late, echoed from the shadows beneath a yew tree. If only I'd listened, murmured a figure dissolving near a family crypt. Each phrase was like a barb, hooking into her own raw wounds. The cemetery seemed to know her pain, reflecting it back at her through the voices of its dead, twisting her personal grief into the universal sorrow that saturated this ground. It was a cruel, psychological assault, leveraging the very reason she had dared to enter this place against her. The air grew thick with the emotional weight, pressing down, making each breath feel heavy, each step an effort. It felt like wading through invisible molasses. Burdened by the sorrows of generations, Clara felt herself weakening, the edges of her own consciousness blurring under the psychic pressure. She was losing herself in the collective lament, the boundary between her grief and the ancient, accumulated grief of St. Michael's becoming terrifyingly thin. The whispers were no longer just around her, they were starting to feel like they were inside her. Just as Clara felt she might succumb to the overwhelming tide of whispers and borrowed sorrows, something shifted. The aimless drifting of the midnight figures changed. A subtle current seemed to flow through the cemetery, a silent call that drew the shadowy forms from their solitary vigils among the graves. One by one, then in small groups, the figures began to move with a new, shared purpose. They turned from their silent observation of her, their forms coalescing slightly, and started to glide slowly, silently, along the winding paths. They moved not like individuals walking, but like currents flowing in the same direction, merging into a slow, silent stream of shadows, a spectral procession. They flowed past Clara, ignoring her now, their focus entirely on some unseen destination deeper within the cemetery's heart. There was no sound accompanying their movement, save for the ever-present, swirling whispers which seemed to rise in intensity, becoming a low, collective moan that resonated deep in Clara's chest. Despite her fear, despite every instinct screaming at her to run in the opposite direction, if such a direction even existed in this shifting place, Clara felt an inexplicable pull to follow. It wasn't curiosity, not entirely. It felt more like a compulsion, a subtle psychic tug emanating from the procession itself, or perhaps from the destination they sought. Was this part of the cemetery's manipulation? Or was something else drawing them? Drawing her? Hesitantly, keeping a distance, Clara fell into step behind the silent parade of shadows. They moved through sections of the cemetery she hadn't yet reached, past grander mausoleums and older, more elaborate monuments. The eerie luminescence seemed slightly brighter here, casting the procession in stark, unsettling relief against the profound darkness. The figures remained indistinct, vaguely human-shaped voids in the night, but as she watched them flow past, her eyes scanned the river of shadows, searching, hoping, dreading. Finch's warning echoed, "Don't trust familiar faces you might think you see." And then, she saw him, or thought she did, among the taller, Adult-shaped shadows gliding silently forward. There was a smaller form, noticeably shorter, slighter. Its movements weren't the smooth glide of the others, there was a hint of a familiar, slightly awkward gait, a way of holding its head tilted slightly to one side. It was further ahead in the procession, partially obscured by other figures. Just a silhouette against the strange light. Clara's breath hitched. Her heart leapt into her throat with a force that was physically painful. Ethan? It couldn't be. It was impossible. Finch had warned her. Illusions, twist your grief against you. It had to be a trick of the light. Her desperate mind projecting the image she most longed to see onto one of the anonymous shadows. But the shape, it was so familiar. The set of the shoulders. The size, it resonated with the image of her brother burned into her memory. He would have been about that height relative to the adults around him. Hope, sharp and dangerous, surged through her, momentarily eclipsing the fear. What if Finch was wrong? What if this was real? What if Ethan was here, caught in this midnight realm, part of this strange procession? The desperate need that had driven her to the gates returned with overwhelming force. She quickened her pace, trying to get closer, trying to get a better look. Weaving slightly through the trailing edge of the spectral parade, the figure remained ahead, maddeningly indistinct, always partially blocked by other shifting shadows. Was it deliberately staying just out of clear view? Ethan? The name escaped her lips. A choked whisper lost in the swirling murmurs of the dead. The small figure didn't react, didn't turn. It simply continued its slow, inexorable progress forward with the rest of the procession. Clara pushed onward, ignoring the chilling brush of unseen forms gliding past her, ignoring the intensifying whispers that clawed at her sanity. Her focus narrowed entirely onto that small, familiar silhouette. Was it truly him, an echo of her brother trapped in this terrible place? Or was it a cruel lure, crafted by the sentient cemetery itself, using her deepest desire to draw her towards its center, towards the heart of its power? Hope and fear warred within her, tearing her apart. The possibility of seeing Ethan again, even as a shadow in this nightmare realm, was a pull almost too strong to resist. But the memory of Finch's grave warning, and the palpable sense of manipulation she felt from the cemetery itself, screamed caution. Following that figure could be the biggest mistake of her life, the final step into a trap from which there might be no return. Yet, she couldn't stop herself, drawn by the ghost of hope, or ensnared by a perfect illusion. Clara followed the spectral procession, and the small, familiar shadow within it, deeper into the heart of the midnight cemetery. The spectral procession flowed onward, leading Clara away from the more manicured paths and into an older, wilder section of St. Michael's. Here, the graves were ancient, many tilted and sunken, their inscriptions rendered illegible by centuries of wind and rain. Gnarled roots broke through the earth, and ivy crawled thick over crumbling stone walls. The air felt heavier here, colder, charged with an almost electric tension. The procession funneled towards a large, natural clearing at the center of this old section, and dominating the clearing, its immense form silhouetted against the strange, internal luminescence of the midnight cemetery, stood a tree. It was colossal, far older and larger than any other tree in St. Michael's. Its trunk was thick and deeply fissured, like the hide of some prehistoric beast. Its branches, bare of leaves despite the season, were gnarled and twisted, reaching towards the oppressive gloom like arthritic fingers. They clawed at the darkness, seeming to drink it in. The ground around its base was strangely bare, a circle of packed earth where even weeds refused to grow. Clara stopped at the edge of the clearing, partially concealed by a crumbling angel statue whose face seemed frozen in a silent scream. A palpable aura radiated from the ancient tree, a deep thrumming energy that resonated with the low hum she'd felt throughout the cemetery. It felt like the source, the nexus, the very heart of this place's consciousness. The midnight figures glided into the clearing, their procession slowing as they approached the tree. They didn't stop, but began to circle it slowly, counterclockwise, a silent vortex of shadows swirling around the massive trunk. The whispers intensified dramatically here, coalescing into a deafening roar within Clara's mind, 1,000 voices murmuring, sighing, weeping, regretting, remembering. It was the concentrated essence of the cemetery's history, its sorrow, its power. Clara frantically scanned the circling figures for the small shadow. The one that looked like Ethan. She spotted it, still maddeningly indistinct, moving with the others, absorbed into the spectral whirlpool around the ancient tree. Seeing it there, so close to the epicenter of this place's power, sent a fresh wave of fear through her. If it was Ethan, what was happening to him? Was he being drawn into the tree? Into the cemetery's core? The atmosphere around the tree was incredibly dense, thick with psychic energy. Clara felt a powerful, ancient presence emanating not just from the tree itself, but from the ground beneath her feet. From the very air she struggled to breathe. It felt watchful, intelligent, and unimaginably old. This was the sentient entity Finch had warned her about. The conscious awareness of St. Michael's, and the tree was its anchor. Its focal point. She could feel its attention turning towards her. A slow, ponderous awareness shifting from the circling figures to the lone living soul intruding upon its sacred space. It wasn't a gaze of eyes, but a pressure, a knowing, a cold, ancient intelligence acknowledging her presence. The whisper seemed to momentarily quieten, the figures continuing their silent orbit, as if the cemetery itself was pausing, considering her. Fear held Clara frozen behind the angel statue. She felt utterly exposed, vulnerable, like a microbe under a vast, indifferent microscope. The power radiating from the tree was immense, terrifying. It felt primal, rooted in the earth, connected to the cycles of life and death in a way she couldn't comprehend. It felt like the collective weight of every soul buried here, focused into a single, aware entity. What did it want? Why had it allowed the gates to open? Why lure her here with the spectral procession and the potential illusion of her brother? Was it observation, curiosity, or something more sinister? The pressure intensified. The whispers started again, but different now, less fragmented, more focused. They seemed to emanate directly from the tree, from the air around it, speaking not in individual voices, but as a collective chorus. A single chilling drone directed at her. Clara pressed herself against the cold stone of the angel, trying to make herself smaller, invisible, but there was no hiding from the consciousness that permeated this entire space. She was at the heart of the Midnight Cemetery, before its ancient, powerful core, and she had the terrifying feeling that it was about to make its intentions known. The silent observation was ending. Communication, or perhaps confrontation, was about to begin. The oppressive atmosphere around the ancient tree solidified, becoming almost viscous. The swirling whispers coalesced, no longer a chaotic blend of fragmented memories, but a single, pervasive voice, or rather, the impression of a voice, speaking directly inside Clara's mind. It wasn't male or female, young or old, it was the collective resonance of the cemetery itself. Ancient, cold, and vast. You seek connection, the mental voice intoned, echoing with the sighs of centuries. You bring fresh sorrow to this old ground. A raw wound in the tapestry of endings. Clara flinched, pressing her hands against her temples. But the voice wasn't auditory, it was a direct intrusion into her thoughts. Inescapable. It knew why she was here. We are the keepers, the voice continued. The collective, we, emphasizing its nature as a repository of countless souls and memories. We guard the echoes. We hold the final breaths, the lingering regrets, the shadows of what was. This is the threshold, the quiet place between. It confirmed Finch's words. This wasn't just a graveyard, it was a conscious entity. A guardian of the liminal space between life and death. Powered by the accumulated weight of memory and sorrow held within its bounds. You have crossed the gate. The voice resonated, cold and dispassionate. You walk among the shades in the hour when the veil is thin. Such passage requires acknowledgement. A toll. A toll? Clara's blood ran cold. Finch had warned her about bargains. This felt like the preamble to something terrible. What do you want? Clara thought the question, too terrified to speak aloud. Though she knew it made no difference. The collective consciousness seemed to consider her. The pressure intensifying. The midnight figures continued their slow, silent circling of the tree, their forms flickering like candle flames in a draft. The small figure, the one resembling Ethan, remained among them. A constant, painful reminder of her desperate hope. Your grief is strong, the voice stated, a chillingly neutral observation. It shines brightly in this place of faded sorrows. It resonates. We feel it. We, Collect such things. Collect? The word sent a shiver down Clara's spine. This entity wasn't just a passive guardian, it was a collector. A collector of the most potent human emotion tied to its domain, grief. You desire to touch the echo of the one you lost. The voice continued, honing in on her deepest vulnerability. To bridge the silence, we hold the echoes, shimmering fragments of those who rest here. Connection is possible. In this place. In this hour. Clara's heart hammered. Was it offering her what she came for? A chance to speak to Ethan? But the threshold demands balance. The voice asserted, the cold edge returning. A crossing requires an exchange. Your intrusion disturbs the quiet. Your living sorrow disrupts the patterns. A price must be paid. What price? Clara thought, dread coiling in her stomach. A piece of your connection. A thread of your memory. A fragment of your grief. The demand hung in the air, monstrous in its implications. It didn't want money or sacrifice in the traditional sense. It wanted something intangible, yet infinitely precious. A piece of her memory of Ethan? A portion of the very grief that defined her existence right now? What would that even mean? To lose a memory? To have her sorrow lessened? Not through healing, but through psychic amputation? Give us a part of the sorrow you carry for the lost boy. The voice elaborated, sending a chilling image into her mind. Her grief is a tangible thing. A dark, heavy shroud, and the cemetery reaching out spectral tendrils to pluck a piece away. Offer a memory, his laugh, his final words, the pain of his absence. Anchor it here, within our collection. In return, the image of the small shadow near the tree sharpened slightly in Clara's mind's eye, turning just enough for her to almost see a familiar profile. A moment. A whisper, a fleeting touch across the veil. It was a twisted, terrifying bargain, a Faustian pact offered by a graveyard. Surrender a piece of her essential connection to Ethan, the very memories and pain that proved her love, in exchange for a potentially illusory, fleeting contact brokered by this cold, ancient entity. Was the figure by the tree even Ethan's echo? Or just bait, constructed by the cemetery from her own desires? To accept the bargain would be to desecrate her memory of him. To trade a piece of her soul, her love, her pain, for a ghost of a promise. Yet, the desperation to connect, to alleviate the crushing weight of her loss even for a moment, was a powerful lure. The cemetery waited, its ancient consciousness pressing in on her, demanding an answer. The midnight figures circled, silent witnesses. The small shadow flickered, a heartbreaking question mark at the heart of the terrifying proposal. The price of crossing the midnight gates was becoming terrifyingly clear. Clara stood frozen, trapped between the chilling demand of the cemetery and the desperate yearning of her own broken heart. The collective voice waited, patient as stone, exerting a subtle pressure, amplifying her grief, making the offer seem almost reasonable in its terrible logic. Give a little pain to gain a moment's solace. Offer a memory to hear a whisper. Her mind raced, replaying Finch's warnings. Be careful of bargains, whispers that promise what your heart desires most. Don't trust easy answers or familiar faces. He had known this might happen. He had tried to prepare her. Remember why you came, Miss Hayes, but don't let that reason become your prison. Why had she come? To find Ethan, to assuage her guilt, to escape the suffocating finality of death. But was this the way? Trading her memories, the very essence of her bond with him, for a fleeting, potentially false connection orchestrated by a parasitic entity that collected sorrow? She looked towards the circling figures, towards the small shadow that might or might not be her brother. What would Ethan want? He wouldn't want her to diminish her memory of him, to chip away at their shared past, just for a ghostly glimpse. He wouldn't want her trapped here, bound to this place by a corrupted bargain. The love they shared, the real love, existed in her memories, in the grief itself. Painful as it was, that pain was proof of the love's depth. To give it away felt like a betrayal. The cemetery sensed her hesitation. The pressure increased. Images flooded her mind, unsolicited. Ethan laughing on his birthday. Ethan waving goodbye that last morning, the raw, hollow feeling of the empty space he left behind. The voice amplified these feelings, twisting them. See? So much pain. Let us take some. Ease the burden. Just a small piece. A fair exchange? Clara squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the insidious persuasion. She remembered something else Finch had said. Something cryptic about surviving, about holding on to herself, respecting the space. Perhaps the toll didn't have to be what the cemetery demanded. Perhaps there was another way to acknowledge the crossing, to appease the threshold guardian without sacrificing herself. What could she offer? Not a piece of her grief, not a memory torn from her soul, but maybe acknowledgement, acceptance, a different kind of offering. The test wasn't just about accepting or rejecting the bargain. The test was about how she navigated her grief in this place of power. Would she succumb to the temptation of a false cure? Or could she find the strength to face her loss honestly? Even here, surrounded by the echoes of the dead and the predatory consciousness of the cemetery? Taking a deep, shuddering breath, Clara pushed herself away from the illusory safety of the angel statue and stepped into the clearing. The midnight figures continued their slow orbit around the tree, but the collective attention of the cemetery focused entirely on her. The pressure was immense, trying to force her compliance. She wouldn't fight it directly, Finch had warned against that, but she wouldn't yield either. She walked slowly towards the ancient tree, stopping a respectful distance from its gnarled roots and the circling shadows. She looked towards the small figure, the potential Ethan, and felt a pang of sorrow so deep it almost broke her resolve. But it also strengthened it. I came seeking my brother. She projected the thought, trying to infuse it with clarity and strength, pushing back against the cemetery's mental intrusion. My grief is my own. My memories are mine. They are precious, even the painful ones. They are proof of love. I will not trade them. The cemetery's response was a wave of cold displeasure, a surge in the psychic pressure. The threshold demands its due. You disturb the quiet. I acknowledge this place, Clara projected, forcing calm into her thoughts. I acknowledge the sorrow held here. I acknowledge the boundary I crossed. She reached into her pocket, her fingers closing around something small and smooth. It was a skipping stone Ethan had given her years ago, found on a beach during their last family holiday. He'd claimed it was magic, that it could grant wishes if skipped perfectly. She'd kept it tucked away in a drawer. On impulse, she'd put it in her pocket before leaving tonight. It wasn't a piece of her grief, or a core memory ripped out. It was a token, a symbol of remembrance, freely given, an acknowledgement of Ethan, of her love, of her loss. Offered respectfully, not extorted. I offer this, she thought, holding the stone out in her palm. A memory freely given, not taken, a symbol of the connection I sought. I honor my brother, and I honor the peace of those who rest here. But I will not diminish my love or my grief to pay your toll. She placed the small, smooth stone gently on the bare earth near the base of the ancient tree, just outside the circle of the swirling figures. The cemetery's reaction was instantaneous. A silent roar of displeasure echoed in her mind. The pressure became crushing. The whispers surged into a cacophony of angry, accusatory voices. The midnight figures stopped circling, their shadowy forms turning towards her, seeming to grow taller, more menacing. The air crackled with barely contained power. She had refused the bargain. She had defied the collector. Now, she would face the consequences. The moment Clara placed the skipping stone on the ground, the fragile truce shattered. The cemetery's ancient consciousness recoiled from her offering, enraged by her refusal of its morbid bargain. The air grew heavy, thick with malice. The ground beneath her feet seemed to vibrate with suppressed fury. Insolence. The mental voice was no longer a cold drone but a furious chorus, crashing against her mind. You defy the balance. You deny the toll. The gate will remain shut. You will become part of the quiet, part of the collection. The midnight figures surged forward, no longer passive observers. They flowed towards her from the base of the tree, a wave of coalescing shadows, their vague forms sharpening, resolving into expressions of anguish and accusation drawn from the collective sorrow. Hands made of deeper darkness reached for her, cold tendrils of despair seeking to grasp, to hold, to absorb her into their spectral ranks. Clara stumbled backward, terror washing over her. This wasn't a physical attack. Not exactly, but a psychic assault. Waves of concentrated grief, regret, and loneliness hammered against her defenses, seeking to overwhelm her, to break her spirit, to make her want to give in, to become one of them. The whispers became screams in her mind, echoing her own deepest fears and guilt about Ethan. Your fault, they shrieked. You let him go. You didn't save him. Stay. Pay. She turned and ran, stumbling through the ancient, uneven ground, away from the tree, away from the heart of the power. She didn't know where she was going, instinct driving her towards the direction she vaguely remembered the entrance gates being. The cemetery fought her, paths twisting, roots seeming to snag her feet, low branches whipping at her face. The midnight figures pursued her, not running, but flown through the landscape like smoke carried on a malevolent wind. They appeared suddenly in her path, forcing her to swerve, their chilling proximity draining her warmth, their psychic projections intensifying the assault on her mind. But something had shifted within Clara. Refusing the bargain, choosing to honor Ethan's memory authentically rather than trading it, had ignited a spark of defiance, a core of resilience she hadn't known she possessed. Her grief was still immense, a gaping wound, but it was hers. It would not be weaponized against her by this ancient, sorrow-hoarding entity. "Leave me alone," she screamed aloud, the sound raw and desperate in the unnatural quiet. "He wouldn't want this. My grief is not yours to take." She focused on the memory of Ethan's laugh, the genuine one, not the illusion. She pictured his face, bright and alive. She held on to the feeling of love, fierce and protective, pushing back against the crushing weight of the cemetery's despair. The gates. She had to reach the gates. Finch said they wouldn't open until dawn. But maybe, just maybe, if she could reach the threshold, the cemetery's hold might weaken closer to the boundary with the outside world. It was a desperate hope, but the only one she had. Through sheer will and frantic scrambling, navigating the shifting, hostile terrain, she finally saw them, the massive wrought iron gates, silhouetted against a sky that was no longer pitch black, but held the faintest, almost imperceptible lightening towards the east. Dawn was approaching, but the gates remained firmly shut, chained and padlocked by unseen forces. And between her and the gates stood a final phalanx of midnight figures. Denser, darker than the others, coalesced from the cemetery's rage. They blocked her path, a silent, menacing barrier. The collective consciousness of the cemetery seemed focused here. At the threshold, determined to keep her trapped, Clara skidded to a halt, panting, cornered. The figures advanced slowly, inexorably. The psychic pressure was almost unbearable. This was the final confrontation. Not a battle of fists or weapons, but a battle of wills. A confrontation with the sentient grief of St. Michael's itself. She had nothing left to offer but her acceptance. Not acceptance of the cemetery's twisted demands, but acceptance of her reality. Acceptance of Ethan's death. Acceptance of the pain she carried. Taking another ragged breath, she faced the advancing shadows. "He's gone," she whispered, the words tasting like ash, yet feeling profoundly true. "He's gone, and it hurts, but I won't let you take my memory of him. I won't let you twist my love into something ugly." She spoke the words aloud, her voice trembling but clear, projecting them towards the figures, towards the gates, towards the listening cemetery. "I accept the pain. I accept that he's not coming back. But I will remember him. I will carry him with me. Always." She closed her eyes, not in surrender, but in concentration, focusing on the love, the good memories, letting the sharp edges of grief exist alongside them, acknowledging the whole truth of her loss without letting it be consumed or corrupted. It was an act of profound emotional honesty, a rejection of the cemetery's parasitic need for distorted sorrow. A tremor ran through the ground. The psychic pressure wavered, fluctuating like a disturbed signal. The advancing figures hesitated, their forms flickering uncertainly. Her raw, honest acceptance, her refusal to feed the darkness with bartered pain or denial, seemed to confuse the ancient consciousness, disrupting its power. As Clara stood her ground, eyes closed, focused on the painful, honest acceptance of her loss, the first true hint of dawn painted the eastern horizon beyond the cemetery walls. A pale, gray light began to seep into the sky, diluting the oppressive, unnatural darkness that had reigned within St. Michael's. The change was palpable. The crushing psychic pressure began to recede, like a tide going out. The furious mental voice of the cemetery faded, replaced once more by the fragmented, directionless whispers, now sounding faint and distant. The air grew lighter, losing its suffocating thickness. The intense cold lessened, allowing the natural chill of the pre-dawn morning to emerge. Clara opened her eyes, The phalanx of midnight figures before the gates flickered violently. Their forms grew thin, translucent, losing cohesion in the encroaching light. The anger and menace drained from them, leaving only weary, sorrowful shadows. One by one, they dissolved, melting back into the receding darkness like mist burning off in the morning sun. Within moments, the path to the gates was clear. And then, with a soft, metallic click that echoed the sound that had begun her ordeal hours earlier, the unseen mechanism holding the gates shut released its grip. The heavy chain slithered loosely. Slowly, with a faint, weary groan of ancient hinges, the massive wrought iron gates began to swing inward, opening not with the deliberate, menacing slowness of midnight, but with a gentle, releasing sigh. The way out was clear. Clara stared, hardly daring to believe it. Exhaustion washed over her in a dizzying wave. Physical, mental, and emotional. She felt drained, scoured clean, yet strangely whole. She hadn't found the easy answers or the impossible reunion she had desperately craved. There was no miraculous message from Ethan. No comforting spectral touch. The small figure by the tree, whether illusion or faint echo, had offered no solace, only temptation. But she had survived. She had faced the sentient heart of the cemetery, confronted its parasitic demands, and refused to sacrifice her grief or her memories. She had found the strength to accept the terrible finality of Ethan's death without letting the darkness consume her. It wasn't the closure she'd imagined, but it was a step. A hard, painful, necessary step on the long path towards healing. She walked, legs trembling, towards the open gateway. As she stepped across the threshold, back onto the narrow lane outside, it felt like breaking the surface after being submerged for far too long. The air was fresh, cool, ordinary. The sounds of the waking town, a distant car, birds beginning to chirp, were blessedly normal. She turned back one last time. The interior of St. Michael's looked almost normal now in the growing light. The headstones stood in neat rows. The trees were just trees. The shadows were simply shadows. The eerie luminescence was gone. The oppressive atmosphere lifted. Behind her, the heavy iron gates swung slowly shut with quiet finality, the latch clicking firmly into place as the first rays of the rising sun touched their cold metal. St. Michael's Cemetery stood silent and still in the morning light, its midnight secrets safely guarded once more. Clara Hayes turned away and started the long walk home, carrying the weight of her experience, the memory of the midnight figures and the ancient tree, and the enduring ache of her brother's absence. But she also carried a newfound resolve, a bittersweet understanding of loss and acceptance. Forged in the heart of the midnight realm, the gates were closed, but for Clara, a different kind of passage had just begun. Enjoyed the story? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below.